one of the places in the world that has the highest penetration of residential solar is Australia. How do they do that? We're going to hear about that, some lessons from down under from Hugh Bromley of BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Hugh?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I work with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, a research firm, looking across these sectors here. The new technologies, the new business models, finance models, and the innovations that are really changing our energy markets. And I in particular focus on the distributed energy markets, the rooftop solar, in-home batteries, and home and business displays that are talk to what Eric was alluding to in the last session. And when understanding that, you need to understand what drives the different markets. And across different cultures, different geographies, different technologies, consumers act differently. Whether that's understanding that over 80% of residential solar that's built in Japan goes on brand new homes. Whether it's understanding the finance mechanism in the US market and how that drives mechanisms here. Whether it's understanding how Germany succeeded whilst they have one of the lowest home ownership rates in the Western world in growing out a residential PV market. And one of the tools we do to understand this is the Bass diffusion model. Developed in the 60s by Dr. Frank Bass. It talks to when consumers buy and different consumer classes of innovators and imitators. When a new technology or a new consumer good is introduced to a market, Frank Bass said that you had a wave of innovators that drove initial deployment. These people purchased based on their own desire to be leaders. The imitators followed the pack. They had an overwhelming desire to be normal, and therefore, as more people claimed a new technology, they needed to fit in with that new normality and adopt also. It's a model that's been fit against multiple technologies historically, whether it be going back over 100 years to the infrastructure-heavy technologies, electricity rollout, telephone rollout, radios, or new consumer appliances, home electronic devices, which have been adopted much more quicker. And when you think about the iterations, smartphones over mobile phones, over mobile telephony, the general consensus is that adoption rates are accelerating over time. That is, we as consumers are adopting quicker, and we are disposing quicker as well, and moving to new technologies. The Bass model is, consumer uptake has caused disruption in numerous sectors, and this is just one: newspaper revenue, advertising revenues, and newspaper readership over the last 70 or so years. And what you see is that as the internet was rolled out, looking in the early 90s, when internet adoption rates were only around 5%, through to the late 90s, about 30, 40%, through to the early 2000s, and now, when you're talking about adoption rates of 80 to 100% in most countries, you see a massive disruption that impacts these sectors. But not for solar. After 10 years of market deployment, and the finance mechanisms in place and the regulatory mechanisms in place to support deployment, most countries still see very low adoption rates. The US, around 0.7% of homes today have solar on the roof. Germany, around 2%, Japan, around 4%. There is, however, one outlier. 1 in 5 Australian homes have solar on their roof. That's photovoltaic solar. In some states, it's 30%. In some cities or towns, it's pushing 40% of homes have rooftop solar. There is one other outlier as well. Hawaii here, around 14% across the state, looking at all residential customers, have access to rooftop PV. But the rest of the country clearly trails. So looking back to the Bass model and understanding, well, who are the innovators that drive initial deployment, and where have they been for these markets that are still at low single-digit adoption rates? Well, the thought was it would be the prolific entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, who just today made new headlines looking to take control of Solar City once more. It could be founders like Jigga Shaw, who really instigated early financing for the C&I space. It could be the technology side, where you see Dr. Martin Green of the UNSW Labs, who released many of the patents which are now the mainstream technologies at the highest conversion efficiencies. It could be the founder of Suntech, Zheng Gongxi. Now, Zheng Gongxi, in his early years of adoption, the early 2000s through to 2010, before the Suntech collapse, was pushing the largest scale of production. more modules into the market than anyone else. But it wasn't. And if you look at the data for Australia with that 19% adoption rate, you see that actually the trend emerges that it's fairly low income levels or moderate income levels that drove PV adoption. Then in the distribution of ages, you see that most adopters were of retirement age, 61 plus. So who were the innovators? It was the baby boomers, and trailing the baby boomers, it was Generation X. It was people who had a home, had potentially a fixed income or a moderate income, and were willing to spend put the capital outlay in order to deliver savings over the lifetime of the system. It wasn't the rich environmentalists. In fact, it was probably this baby boomer here. So I thought, people often question this data. They say, is Australia really at 19% penetration? Is it really the golden oldies who have installed solar? So I looked at my own family for this presentation and thought, well, who has installed so far? And the first one was my Uncle John. He installed back in 2010 a 4 kilowatt system in the suburbs of Canberra. And when you look at his social demographic, you see that it's Canberra, it's the national capital, it's reasonably young, it's reasonably progressive. But John himself was a public servant. When he installed, he was around 60 of retirement age, and it made sense for him. He was in fact a geologist working in the oil and gas sector for the government. So it was not the expected candidates. And when you look across his neighbourhood, you see that even in Canberra, where it drops below freezing in winter, you have around one in 6 homes with solar today. This is solar hot water heating, and I counted them up here, but it doubles that number again. I thought the next one was actually my grandmother, my nana. She installed a 3 kilowatt system a couple of years ago. And again, it made sense for her. You see the solar hot water on her roof and a newer photovoltaic system next to it. Looking around her neighbourhood, and this is a very conservative area in New South Wales, where people vote conservative, they by no means are driven by an environmental motivation. You look at the adoption rate across this suburb, and suddenly this is like Miami, Florida. The golden oldies are taking charge of their power bill and installing solar. I couldn't count the hot water systems here. It was essentially every home. So it strikes me that this model we have in the US may not be scalable, where to get solar on your rooftop today, you need a credit score of on average 750, but you'll struggle if it's below 700. How can you scale to the high penetration levels that we're trying to achieve to get 100% renewables if you immediately lose 38% of the market, maybe 50% of the market, through the credit worthiness of the off-taker? And when we look at the costs and the fact that the network effect is already occurring in the US, and 40% of sales, we say, come through decisions that are customers that are already going to install because they saw it on their neighbours' roofs. Customer instigated, people that already had decided to install because they wanted it, 28%. So the enormous marketing effort being made by SolarCity, Sunrun, the third-party residential installers are delivering only 28% of the market in terms of new installations. The money invested is not delivering the result that was expected. It's not just about cost, though, because when we multiply the system price and the fact that the US is paying around twice what Western Europe is for the same systems being installed, and the fact that you have around the same capacity factors, the average system size is larger across most US states, that owing to net metering policies that distort the average system size. You multiply those through together and you end up with an average system cost, this is a couple of years old, looking at those early movers, of more than double what would be incurred by the average Australian homeowner looking to install. So solar is cheap in Sydney and cheap in Australia, but it's not cheap that matters, it's affordable. And we look across the cultural difference here again, and we see that in terms of gross income, in terms of disposable income, in terms of savings and savings culture, and I think most importantly potentially, the property value. And you see that on those affordability metrics, Australia comes out way in front. When solar costs 1% of your home equity, it's very easy to find those extra funds to withdraw against your home valuation, withdraw against your mortgage. So looking back at the diffusion of past technologies and understanding why has solar not followed these curves, or in fact has it not? And here I've rebased them back to the year of introduction, year 0. There's adoption across the 3 largest residential PV markets, Japan, Germany, the United States, in that order. The 4th largest, Australia, is starting to follow that curve. We could see ubiquitous adoption yet for residential PV. With that, thank you.